so I'm just going to go through some slides really quickly to level set the audience, and then I'm going to turn it over to my panelists and myself, and we will have what I believe will be a fruitful dialogue about where the depression market is today and where we see it going, both from the perspective of the clinical, regulatory, and market access reimbursement. So, as I'm sure is review for everyone on the line, depression and its psychiatric disorder, anxiety, underwent a massive explosion in the 90s and early aughts with the introduction, commercial success, and subsequent genericization of reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, SNRIs. The need, specifically in depression, and of course, suicide incidence doesn't itself speak only to unipolar depression, but the need remains nonetheless, and this can be attributed to a number of different factors, not in the least being the fact that SSRIs themselves do not necessarily work for a given patient. Patients have to wait often weeks before they know if a particular drug is going to work before switching to another one. And there's a relative limited number of mechanistic options in terms of the different therapies that are available that can address those patients for whom available options are not working. Just to speak very briefly to the partnering activity historically, and this is data pulled from DCIQ and then processed by ourselves, you can see that there's been some deals that have been done in the past, let's say, decade, and in terms of the number of deals, there haven't been a great many. In terms of the mechanisms of the assets involved, there are a few themes that come out, but generally speaking, the activity has been somewhat modest and, dare I say, uninspired, just from the perspective of the fact that there have been different assets encompassing NMDA antagonists, opioid receptor antagonists, and there have been a number of high-profile failures that may have dissuaded companies who invested large amounts in this space historically from perhaps doing so going forward. So I want to get into some of those questions with my panelists. The pipeline is, again, not overly populated given the context and the unmet need. And if we're talking specifically about phase 2+ programs and then breaking those down by the mechanism of action of the different assets involved, if anything stands out, it's NMDA receptor modulators and perhaps a few others such as GABA-A agonists, which we'll speak to momentarily. And so when speaking about the different programs that are up for regulatory approval, potentially in the coming year or so, the high-profile ones that many of us have heard about, including Sage's neurosteroid programs with brexanolone and its oral agent 217 coming up behind it, and ketamine and Janssen seeking to commercialize that specifically with an enantiomer that's intranasally delivered, S-ketamine. And so there have been various clinical reports on these and next generation analogs as well. So I want to speak with my panelists about some of these, but suffice it to say, the value proposition for these programs, aside from them being having novel or orthogonal mechanisms of action relative to the reuptake inhibitors, is the fact that they potentially offer more rapid acting relief for patients for whom Waiting multiple weeks before they know if a drug is going to work can be pretty harrowing, to say the least. The fact that they're addressing, at least in the case of Sage's brexanolone, novel patient populations in the form of refractory postpartum depression. So I think all these things speak to broader questions about whether the market is ripe for broader catalysis in the context of further investment, further innovation, which ultimately will address the broader market and unmet needs that exist. When looking at the commercial potential, and this is measured based on from Evaluate Pharma's consensus analyst forecast, you can see obviously SSRIs, and if we went back into the 90s, which was shown on the earlier slide, SSRIs, of course, had a huge position. They've since gone off patent, and there's potentially some diversification on the horizon, which is highlighted with some of the different programs. And so it'll be interesting to see if these forecasts do bear out, and ultimately if the diversification is as attractive as this chart would make it appear. There have been some roller coaster rides, both in terms of Sage's valuation, which has gone down and then up and then really up, largely with valuation from the perspective of investors seem to be hinging not on their most advanced program, brexanolone, but the oral agent 217 that's behind it. And then Alkermes, which has a kappa opioid receptor modulator. Shouldn't be agonist, sorry about that. That was rebuffed by the FDA, and then subsequently FDA turned around and said they will accept the available data package for review, which surprisingly didn't actually restore share price for Alkermes back to its pre-falling off the cliff levels. So that's interesting. Maybe we can speak to that a little bit as well, what the reasoning behind that might be. But just to get to the overarching questions that I have for my panelists, and that I'm hoping we can discuss today, are we moving towards potentially a tipping point or a virtuous cycle? If you look at my chart starting on the bottom right, what are the unmet needs? What are the opportunities today from the perspective of patients, clinicians, and market access? Are the agents that are up for approval today potentially addressing some of those gaps? If so, are they one-offs themselves, or do they catalyze further investment and enthusiasm in the space? If they don't, obviously the unmet need doesn't go away. What does that portend for depression and psychiatry in general in terms of future innovation, future investment? And I just put up a quote here from our own Ginger Johnson, which speaks to the challenges, and this is addressing CNS more broadly, but I think it's very applicable for depression specifically, which is the issue that you have commercial risk, you also have technical risk, and so in toto, that speaks to unmet need that is not matched by the innovation and the investment activity in the space. So I will leave it there. We have a couple of other slides provided by Roger, which we'll touch upon as we go throughout our discussion today. But I just wanted to start the question again on the bottom right of my cycle here, and I'll put it to Harry Tracy to start us off and ask the question about what are the unmet needs today. Obviously, we have a glut of generic reuptake inhibitors available to patients. They're not expensive to the market. But nonetheless, there's at least some innovation going on in this space. Presumably, there's still considerable amounts of unmet needs. So, Harry, can you just speak to that at a high level, and then I want to kind of let Roger speak to his perspective from market access. So, Harry?
Well, let me make one comment from a low level, and Roger will then speak it in a much more sophisticated way. But as payers watch these programs evolve, I think the overall question they have is, what's in it for me? And that isn't actually what's of benefit to the company or even the patients. It's what time bomb are you trying to plant in terms of increased costs? And I think the industry, to a certain degree, has brought this on itself by for a decade or two, coming up with reformulations that really were of little added value other than to their bottom line. So I think that's the cynicism with which new drugs are going to be responded to by payers. But Roger will pick up on that in much more sophisticated detail. In terms of what we look at, in terms of where these new drugs may take us, deficits in what we have now with all the generics, as you mentioned, slow onset of effect. 3 weeks is a long time to wait, see if you are getting any benefit at all, and then having to start another trial. It feels interminable. So hence the popularity of some programs that I'll go back to in a second that at least hope to provide benefit in hours to days. Secondly, the current crop, there's a large treatment refractory population. A lot of patients that get called TRD. Less than half get adequate results from the first trial. And even after 3 or 4 trials, there's still up to 25, even 30% of depressed patients who don't get enough relief. Third, side effects. You have 70, 80% of people on the current generics who have problematic side effects, particularly sexual side effects, weight gain. Over 40% may discontinue prematurely due to these side effects. So for some depressed patients, it's a pyrrhic choice of lousy outcomes, being depressed or highly aversive side effects. And something we don't talk about much, discontinuation effects. SSRIs in particular, a lot of them are prone to problems in terms of stopping them. Patients go through what may be several weeks or longer of a very aversive process, and that just complicates it, adds more psychiatric visits, adds costs, and decreases their satisfaction. And I would note that depression is not a homogeneous construct, and we haven't had much success in breaking it into its constituent subparts, but I think the work being done with postpartum depression illustrates one example of parsing out a meaningful population. Anxiety, anhedonia, suicidality are other areas that are getting some attention as we try to address the problem that we've had in treating depression as a large singular entity, which it isn't. All right, now going back to the first deficit, slow onset of effect. This is where the rapid-acting antidepressant category comes from, and that, of course, traces back to the discovery that ketamine seems to, and there's still some controversy, but seems to have some rapid effect in some patients. And that led to J&J's esketamine program, which is chemically related, isomer, but it's also given intranasally, since ketamine is given IV. And we've had some results from their phase 3 program, and frankly, after much anticipation, they were disappointing.
Yeah, Harry, I'm sorry to jump in. I definitely want to get to those, and we will. But I think before we get into the specific programs,
okay,
I'd love to hear what Roger says. So if you're a payer or an arbiter of market access, be it at a hospital or on a private plan or a government plan, How do the different needs sit with you, Roger? I mean, obviously, I don't think payers are sitting there complaining about unmet needs from a clinical perspective, but assuming that there are programs, therapeutic options that address some of those different categories, whether it's rapid acting or the ability to address patients that are resistant to a monolithic class like SSRIs by introducing a novel mechanistic option, or side effects or withdrawal. How do those, how does a payer look at those things? And maybe there are things that overlap with the unmet needs of patients, hopefully, but maybe there are things that don't, and maybe there are things that aren't even on the radar of a clinician or an innovator. So it'd be great to hear you kind of chime in at this point before we get into some of the specific programs.
Sure, Joel. I guess the first thing to consider is that payers, as their name implies, look at things from an economic point of view. And the first thing that they're going to look for is some kind of cost offset. And there have been various attempts to show cost offsets in other areas of neurology, in psychiatry in particular, the long-acting antipsychotics, which for most payers did not really pan out. The idea that you could actually save healthcare costs by reducing rehospitalization. But more broadly, I think that as we move into a sort of value-based world, where payers are increasingly looking to sort of the risk-sharing contracts or value-based contracts to set the economic boundaries of drugs. There are some unmet needs for patients that kind of accord with unmet needs for payers. And one of them is, how do you know whether a drug is working or not? Well, one of the problems with with drugs that take a long time to see whether they're working or not is you just have to keep paying for that drug, and then you don't really know whether the drug is working for quite a while. But with the rapid onset or rapid acting drugs, you can actually start to do contracts that that have quite limited time horizons, and say, if the drug works within a very short period of time, great, we'll keep paying for it, or we'll stop, or we no longer need to pay for it because it's cured the person. If it's a sort of one of those one-shot deals. Or if it doesn't work, we can stop paying for it. So that's a really interesting new feature of the rapid-acting drugs. They kind of fit in nicely into a new way of thinking about payer contracting. The other kind of thing that I think is increasingly of concern with new drugs is something that Harry referred to, which are these continuation effects. So you don't really know what the cost of a drug is if there are going to be additional costs that you can't realize from clinical trials. And I think payers are concerned about the longer side effects, shall we say, economic side effects of these drugs going forward. So that's just a quick overall view.
Great. So in addition to unmet needs, and Roger, I'm going to again have you speak to the question of, if you're an innovator, trying to position yourself in a space which you can see a lot of opportunity, both in terms of the need, the lack of great options or the limited number of great options, but pitching that against the issue of, a generic standard of care, and as Harry alluded to, cynicism that's likely been created in large part due to reformulations and improvements over existing commercial brands. What are the opportunities, aside from the unmet need that resonates with payers per se, what are the implications, for example, of a drug that addresses an indication in which payers don't currently have a budget for, or coming in with an IV drug versus an oral drug? Some of these things that aren't necessarily going to be intuitive from an opportunity standpoint, but nonetheless speak to, at least as things stand today, in terms of the market access landscape, that create potential opportunities.
Well, so if you think about psychiatric drugs in particular, they start with an inherent advantage over many other categories of drugs, in that they generally fall into one of the so-called protected classes. That is to say, Medicare and Medicaid have to actually have the antipsychotic or antidepressant on the formulary by law. The issue is, of course, is that they don't have to, that the managed plans don't have to put those drugs first. They can require patients to step through other drugs before that, but they can't exclude them, which is something that, of course, they can do in cardiology or inflammatory disease. So that's a significant benefit. In terms of other kinds of non-obvious things, IV drugs have an odd advantage as well, because these so-called medical benefit drugs, or Part B as in boy drugs, are much more difficult for payers to routinely manage. It's much easier for them to manage either through their PBMs or their own processes. Oral Part B drugs you pick up at the pharmacy, not just oral. For all I know, esketamine is actually going to fall into that class as well. Those are much more strictly, you can get much more information as a payer, and you can much more strictly manage those. So to a weird extent, the less convenient drug is actually, or can actually have a payer advantage. And then, gosh, I forgot what I was going to say. I think that's it so far, Joel. Apologies.
No, not at all. That's great, and I think that gives us a good place to start. And maybe that's a good segue, Harry, to talk a little bit about SAGE, because as I showed in one of my slides, brexanolone is an IV drug. It's positioned specifically for postpartum depression. It's had some impact on the valuation of the company, as can be surmised by the rise and fall of their stock price attached to different press events. But the bigger rise came only when their earlier drug, which is an analog, but an orally available analog of brexanolone, and positioned to address a much broader class of patients, both women and men, and not just in postpartum, but treatment-resistant depression and other areas as well. Only when that succeeded did we see SAGE's stock price and market cap just go through the roof. So it's, I guess the segue for me was Harry talking about, from a payer perspective, you can get some protection as a medical benefit drug, and that's offset, I guess, by the commercial potential of having an oral agent that's positioned to address a much broader swath of patients. So do you want to speak to that program a little bit, and particularly through the lens of this kind of these different balancing these different risk components?
Are you talking about brexanolone or 217? Which one do you want me to speak to?
I think both are really interesting. So I think we could start with brexanolone, and Roger actually has some slides. So while you're talking, I'm going to pull up a slide that Roger has about and just to kind of orient the audience. This will be a slide which shows.
Actually, Joel, let me interrupt you for a second. Why don't you let Harry finish, and then I'll
pull those
then
up.
we can talk about some other slides, so I can explain that stuff.
You got it. So Harry, if you can speak to brexanolone as a very exciting opportunity, but one that isn't necessarily the end-all be-all from the perspective of investors for Sage, and why 217 really kind of put them through the roof, so to speak.
Well, I mean, the beauty of brexanolone, it does address a somewhat circumscribed population, one that's fairly well defined in terms of there's a pregnancy and a depressive episode, and it is a population where traditional oral drugs are often resisted because reluctance to take oral drugs if nursing and so forth. So, and if efficacy is problematic, so it's nice that you've got 200,000 patients and it's well defined, and I think payers are more comfortable with that as opposed to the huge market of depression overall. So brexanolone, as you know, is having its NDA prepared. I think it's a little premature to extrapolate too freely to 217. I mean, people were, and I was certainly pleasantly surprised by the results, and it certainly has some of the characteristics that one would hope for in terms of what seemed to be a rapid effect and pretty significant efficacy. It was just an 89 patient trial, though. I'm a little, while I think any of us who have followed neuroscience have seen small trials not be particularly large trials. I'm not predicting failure here, but I think there's some reason to not anoint it prematurely. The other thing I would note, and I guess I'm playing devil's advocate for a moment because the market has been so enthused, and when I wrote about it, I said, well, it also has the benefit on sleep, so perhaps it will address the sleep issues associated with depression. Well, the counterpoint to that is that it also shows some signs of efficacy in an insomnia trial. So what might seem like a benefit could also be a side effect issue. Is there going to be a dosing window where you try to give enough for antidepressant action, but not so much that you get somnolence? And somnolence was one of the side effects that was mentioned without much detail in their report. So I think anytime I see too much of a bandwagon gathering, I think it is exciting, but I think I'd like to see more than 89 patients, and I would like to see what the window is for efficacy without inducing sedation. So they're going to go into a 450 patient trial that is certainly big enough to give ample information about both those topics. But I'm a little bit more cautious based on those two parameters.
Right, and you had written, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have it in front of me, but I believe you'd written at some point in Neuroinvestments that if 217 pans out, not just in women but in men, I think the point being that the neurosteroid or neurohormone deficit in women made a lot of sense mechanistically. Once we start to see it working in patient populations where you wouldn't expect it to do so, we may have to rewrite the rules or rethink what we understand about depression. And we're not at a point where we want to rewrite those rules, but am I accurately paraphrasing you at least in that regard?
Well, that's one of the reasons for caution. I mean, it makes total sense that in a patient postpartum population where allopregnanolone levels are known to be decreased, that giving a version of that neurosteroid may normatize the situation and aid with depression. The connection to men is a whole lot more obscure. Yet Sage says there was no difference between males and females in their phase 2 in terms of impact. Because mechanistically that begs some questions as to either what it does or what an access point to depression we hadn't thought much about. That's another reason to be slightly cautious about embracing it as here is a brave new world to be fully explored.
That's fair. All right, Roger, I'm going to go ahead and bring up your first slide, and if in the meantime maybe you want to just start speaking to the real endpoints metric, just at a couple of lines about what it is we're going to be looking at while I do that.
Sure. So what we've been doing is we've created this way of taking a look at the access challenges that drugs are going to be facing, and trying to do this in a quantitative and objective and systematic way. And basically what we do is we look at around 21 or 22 different attributes of a drug, of a candidate, a late-stage candidate, and assess each attribute, which is reflective of a payer issue, and score that attribute to see whether it's positive or negative for access. And we've basically done that. We basically do this for all late-stage drugs, and with the slide that you're seeing here is just a set of the likely drug launches, and some of them which have been launched for 2018. And essentially, the longer the bar, the higher the score, the less likely that drug will be to face really significant access challenges. The lower the score, clearly, the more access challenges that drug will face. And it's not to say that a low score means that the drug is going to fail commercially. It just means that company is going to have to figure out how to overcome those challenges, for which there are a variety of strategies. But if you go to the next slide, what we've done here is we're just looking now at the class of 2018 neurology drugs, and you can see that the average score for all drugs is about 114. Neurology in general scores below average, and there's some really cool drugs coming, the migraine prevention drugs, for example, but they will face some access hurdles, probably significantly bigger than their manufacturers had considered when they were first getting their pretty dramatic results. But one of the things that I guess I wanted to focus on a little bit was brexanolone, because brexanolone, as you can see on this graph, is the number 2 scoring drug within the neuro world. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here, well, okay, brexanolone is significantly better than the average neuro drug. And the question is why? Well, we define, or payer defines, unmet need in a way differently than manufacturers do. They define unmet need as really how competitive is this category. And their definition of competitive is a much broader definition than most manufacturers. Another big access advantage is the fact that you only have to give one dose. One of the big problems for payers is that they continue to pay for drugs over time. That's a problem with chronic medicines. It's, of course, an advantage too, but it's a problem for a payer. So if you have a one-shot fix, that's a great thing. They are, to an extent, not a huge extent, but they are to an extent influenced by FDA designations around novelty, and one of those would be breakthrough status, which brexanolone does have. We talked about medical benefit as being an advantage for access because it's more difficult for payers to deal with, and that's certainly true in this case. The other thing is that payers do not like to see themselves in the headlines in negative light, which is mostly how those headlines portray them. And so they respond well to effective patient advocacy. That is to say, they open up access the stronger the advocacy is. And in this category, there is actually a fairly effective set of patient advocates. On the problematic side, and this would apply to any drug, all of these issues, positive or negative, would apply to any drug. We certainly score all drugs on these and other issues. But on the challenging side, this is a brand new area of expense for payers, and that bothers them. They've already created their budgets, and if they have to create a new area of expense, it's challenging for them, for their clients being the employers, who don't like to see big new drug budget categories. Now, yes, this drug is going to have a relatively restricted label for postpartum depression, but the problem is we don't really know how big that world is in the first place. We're talking about severe, moderate to severe, moderate. How big is that? Payers just don't know. The prevalence is uncertain. And one rule of thumb for payers is that once a drug is approved, patients will come out of the woodwork. So that's a big unknown with this drug. The other unknown is whether or not physicians will use this in other indications. So certainly there was some uncertainty around how good this drug is in moderate PPD, but then there are also possible other ways that physicians could use this, and patients and payers are going to be worried about that. And then finally, the question of durability of the effect. There was a 30-day endpoint, which is not a bad endpoint in and of itself, but one doesn't know whether this patient is going to have to be retreated or not. Nonetheless, there's an advantage to that endpoint or to that short-acting drug, which is what we referred to before, is you can, in competitive situations certainly, create contracts where if the effect isn't seen, you pay less or you don't pay for the drug itself. So that's kind of brexanolone from a payer point of view, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Harry because, you know, one thing I don't see on there, and I think would be, you know, at least from the innovator standpoint, a perceived benefit to payers is the productivity question, and, you know, more broadly speaking, just kind of the impact of whether it's postpartum depression or other forms of unipolar or other, you know, psychiatric disorders. You're pulling people out of the workforce. You're pulling people away from areas where they could otherwise prove productive.
So Joel, let me stop you right there, if I can. Joel, let me just, sorry to stop you, but payers, I know this sounds harsh, but payers frankly don't care about productivity. Insurance companies don't. Employers may or may not. but the people making the decision are payers, and productivity rarely comes into their decision making.
Right. Harry,
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant. It doesn't show up in their bottom line. So in the bigger world,
right.
applications are not relevant to them.
Right, but it's not unreasonable to surmise that a company, you know, certainly a development stage biotech who has an exciting new program could potentially get excited or get people excited about the fact that it does have an economic benefit. Do you find that, you know, when you talk to companies that, you know, and they think about market access hurdles and the ability to impact this particular, you know, attribute of depression, that's perhaps an area that they would think, and maybe this is good for them to hear otherwise, but that they would think would be a good sell for payers.
Well, I think where it might come into play would be, and companies don't think about this until they're pretty far along. I mean, the first concern is, does this drug work at all? And then the larger pharmacoeconomic benefits is something that comes to mind when they're trying to figure out who will market it. It might play a role in terms of patient willingness to pay higher copays. There is, you know, when we genericize patients and treat them all like they're a homogeneous population, and it's ignoring the fact that there is some subset of patients who are willing to pay for a better side effect profile, who are willing to pay for faster relief. And as long as companies don't get too greedy, I think there is a realm where, unfortunately, it's economically more advantaged patients may have wider choices. You know, having access to a tier 3 drug if they're willing to pay much higher copay, and that's where productivity may come into focus. If a case could be made for a patient that this is more likely to return you to full functioning, that matters to them.
Right. Well, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that, I guess, speaks to you know, risk sharing between payers and patients, and shifting the burden to more out-of-pocket expenses. And I guess I want to make sure we talk about some of the other programs that are up, which we haven't mentioned. So Harry, you started to speak to ketamine. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, and other NMDA modulators, of which there are a number represented in the pipeline. And so, what are your thoughts on ketamine and rapastinel from Allergan and perhaps others?
Well, ketamine per se is a cottage industry, and because of patent issues, it's going to remain that way. No one can actually commercialize it in a broad-based way. Esketamine and the attempt to deliver it intranasally looks like it is not that rapid and is not necessarily that efficacious. It was kind of mediocre in J&J's studies. Maybe when their suicide risk study comes out, they will show that that's a niche population, but to me, it did not come across as the revolutionary development that many had hoped for, including myself. Now, so the next big endpoint will be Allergan coming up with rapastinel results from 4,000 patients worth of clinical trials, and I think they're saying that they'll start coming out in the first quarter next year. That's an attempt to basically have a ketamine without associated effects as a risk factor. I hear very different reports from different people about whether in clinical sites, whether they see something dramatic or not. So I guess we'll just have to wait for the data, but that would certainly be a big development even for an IV drug if that delivers a patent-protected, brandable IV alternative that could be utilized for more severe depression. there's an oral drug there, but that's really early on, not worth spending too much time on. And frankly, I'm not sure I would spend too much time on the other NMDA modulators. Some of them are their own version of Me Too's. You could actually see boilerplate text showing up in their descriptions that had been used by other companies. So I'm not going to say anything specific about them, but I'm not sure that any of them are major players.
Yeah. And Roger, I know you have one last slide here on the Alkermes drug. You want to speak to that, and then maybe we'll let Harry speak to it as well.
Sure. So, look, there's no question that we need more drugs in this depression category. The challenges here, I think, are greater than they are for brexanolone. This is this fixed combination once-a-day pill from Alkermes. This does not score as well as it might have, given other circumstances. But again, just on the access advantages, it's in a protected class, so it is going to be on formularies. It is a novel mechanism, and that does count for something for payers. Not a tremendous amount, but it is important when P&T committees meet. It is, and they are also, of course, very interested in new options around this disease. It does seem to have some superiority data versus some of the agents, the competitive agents around there. The issue here, however, is that this is a class with many this is a category with many generics, and it is perfectly fine for a lot of the Medicare, Medicaid plans to require patients and commercial plans to require patients to step through drugs before they get to the samidorphan buprenorphine from Alkermes. Payers are also very conscious of how drugs did, not just in any one trial, but in multiple trials. And I believe, Harry, you'll correct me, but I'm no CNS expert. But I believe there were 3 pivotals, and I think there were disappointing results in at least 2 of them. There were good results in the 3rd, but I think there were equivocal results at least in the other 2. Another thing that's important when you think about marketing a drug that's going to be in a competitive field like this one is how strong is the company in that category, or at least in other related categories, which would allow certain kinds of bundling. And Alkermes doesn't really have a lot of power here relative to folks like Janssen or Anopsica, which have more drugs that they can use to induce payers to put in less severe restrictions onto this one. The other thing that we've only barely touched on is the pricing effect on patients. So once a drug hits, roughly $7,900, $8,000 in any event, something like that, it gets put into what's called a specialty tier. And the specialty tier triggers different rules on how much the patient has to pay in Medicare, where there is no ability for a manufacturer to offer copay assistance. So once a drug gets into that specialty category, patients have to pay a much more significant share of that drug back to their Medicare plan or to fee-for-service Medicare. And we don't know the answer here. We don't know what this drug is going to cost. But one thing to be concerned about is in a population of significantly Medicare-age people, if the pricing is high, there could be significant out-of-pocket payment problems for patients. And once you get to certain levels, essentially $75 a month, maybe $100 a month, in terms of coinsurance, which is common, you get really significant abandonment rates. And so that's one thing to watch. I wouldn't put it as an access challenge right now because we don't know what the price is going to be. But it is of concern. So I'll stop there.
Okay. And Harry, what do you think about this program? I know you've written extensively about it, but while we have you, what are your thoughts?
I think that this is where step-throughs will be automatic. You're not going to have first-tier use for 5461. Its great advantage it would be that it's a novel mechanism, and the hope would be that in some subpopulation of people that aren't responsive to SSRIs or SNRIs, kappa opioid antagonism might work. But what has always been kind of underplayed by alchemies is the side effect profile. They, in phase 2, reported 34% nausea, 17% vomiting. That's not a really appealing profile for most folks, unless they've gone through a couple of unsuccessful trials elsewhere and are willing to put up with that. So to me, and the data was affected by a placebo effect and the use of different trial models, and I'll be curious to see what the FDA ends up doing, although I think a case can be made that this is a worthy addition for a small TRD subpopulation. But I can't imagine payers giving it more than a tier 3 or tier 4 level of acceptability. And speaking to Roger's point, I really hope that these companies learn that going for the maximum possible pricing can be self-destructive. There's another, I think there are other strategic choices that might actually pay off more for them, but that's a tough sell for some companies.
All right, so while we're talking, I'm just going to go back to a slide I showed earlier, which is this evaluate pharma consensus sales projection. And the chart certainly gets more colorful in the future than it was in the past, which could potentially speak to, on the surface, diversification. And I know that having looked at other areas like oncology, for example, I know that can spark a field, whether it's trying to improve upon the early movers, or finding orthogonal modalities that can be added as an adjunct onto what are now new branded classes. But if we're within the context of all the different things we're talking about here, we're talking about a new crop of therapies that are potentially going to be on the market in the near term. We're talking about payers scoring at least Sage's brexanolone highly from a market, well, not payers themselves, but a metric saying that from a market access perspective, that program is going to do well from an access perspective. Do these successes, both clinically, technically, and commercially, do they spur further success? And Roger, I know you won't fault me for saying you're not a CNS expert per se, but having your broad perch from the market access standpoint and having seen other therapy areas that have been catalyzed or not, do you get the sense that we're in line perhaps for future innovation, further investment in this space? And if you're a company that's considering broadening or just entering their investment into this space? Do you think that the future is rosy, or it's hard to say, or perhaps it's going to be equally, if not more challenging going forward? What are your thoughts?
Well, I guess the issue is that increasingly advantages to this category, like the protected class advantage, are going to shrink in importance, which means that plans are going to, as Harry was pointing out, require patients to step through less expensive or more preferred drugs, particular generics. The challenge here is, unlike cardiovascular disease or frankly inflammatory disease too, or diabetes, is that there are relatively few hard endpoints that payers measure to define success. So, for example, you can say with a cardiovascular drug, this drug lowers LDL by X, and the previous drugs lowered it by, X minus 50%. That may not get you very far ultimately, but at least it's a way of marking things. And you can tell, and you can often tell in other categories, a fairly dramatic benefit on that marker fairly quickly. The markers in psychiatry are much less, in neurology in general, in fact, are less defined. Migraine is a good example, but certainly the psychiatry drugs are as well, where you have to sort of trust the patient. Do you feel better? Do you not feel better? And yes, there are validated tools, but payers generally don't accept them as much. So one of the real challenges here is to come up with markers of success that payers will appreciate and use. And I don't know, frankly, where we are on that. The other challenge is the challenge in all indications, which is how do you come up with something that nobody else is doing, and come up with it so that your lead is extensive enough so that you can make back a significant portion of your investment. So if you think about migraine, for example, great new, we've seen a great new advance with the anti-CGRPs, but we're also going to have 3 companies on the market within 6-9 months, something like that, and a 4th not long after, which is going to mean that payers are going to try to bargain one against the other for the best possible price, and somebody's going to knuckle under. So with psychiatric drugs, it's they face the similar problem. How are you going to be unique? And Harry was quite specific in talking about this Me Too problem in the NMDA space. I think that's a real challenge here. So I think the unmet needs are huge. That if you come up with a winner here, the value is extraordinary. The challenges are not insubstantial, however. Well, that's how I would put it.
Yeah, and Harry, are there teachable moments from these programs that are on the block today? Do we know, for example, that esketamine or repastinel are targeting NMDA or other components that perhaps could be improved upon, or at least it's worth trying from a hypothesis standpoint, and it makes sense if you're a small company or an investor and you're going to go out with a novel mechanism that perhaps leverages some of the successes technically from things that seem to be working. And I guess, the same could be said with the neurosteroids. Are these mechanisms reducible to practice in terms of optimization, or are they still sufficiently complicated and unknown and perhaps unknowable that one can improve upon them?
I think we need some data. In fact, Repastinol, which I've followed for close to a decade now, there's still some vagueness about exactly how it binds. At this point, I don't think there's enough to go on in terms of fine-tuning something where we don't even know its level of efficacy. If it shows well in early next year, then it is that would justify considerable additional investment. People are trying to, there are people that are lining up in hopes that such is the case. I want to make one comment vis-a-vis what Roger just said, though, and that is, I just did a project where I came up with a figure of 4.5 million adults in the U.S. who are targets for new antidepressants, who don't get either sufficient relief or have highly adverse side effects and don't continue. And that's out of the 20 million or so that there are out there, but there are 4.5 million. You don't actually have to get a huge proportion of those to have a viable commercial product. If you get 10% of just that subpopulation, I think one can start making a commercial case. So, I totally agree with Roger's macro view, but I think there is a place for either for Repastinol, for kappa opioid antagonists, for Trevivo, there are any number of candidates that are in development that if they do end up proving themselves, there will be a place for them as long as companies don't get greedy. I think that opens the door to what might seem like modest penetrance, but in a population this big, I think that would be commercially viable. And if a company sees other companies, A, having clinical success, B, having regulatory success, and C, having some commercial success, they can't help themselves. They will come back into it because there would be then a vacuum that they would perceive that needed to be filled. Right now, they don't see that.
Yeah, and we're running up against the end here, but I just maybe in closing, and this could be a question for both of you. Do you see, Harry? Do you see potential advancements in terms of better understanding the disorder and perhaps segmenting it either on the molecular level or from an imaging perspective that could speak to picking off 10% of the population here or 5% there in a way that's not empirical? And if so, I guess I'll give Roger the last word after Harry speaks about whether that would make, what kind of impact that would have from a market access standpoint.
To be honest, I don't see any biomarkers that, in my view, in the next 5 years are going to make a substantial impact in terms of parsing the population. There are some companies that have genetic tests that they claim help fine-tune optimal antidepressant prescriptions or prescriber choice. Frankly, the validation is flimsy to zero. So at just imaging in 10 years, but I don't see anything at the moment that strikes me as a surrogate marker that is going to reliably let us parse out populations other than ones I already mentioned. I think we're still talking about phenotypic, behavioral, and I know the industry hates that, but I don't see something replacing that in the near term.
Yeah, I certainly can't comment Joel, technically, I don't know the science, but I do know that if you were able to have such markers, whether they were, as Harry's saying, whether they could, sort of predict which patients would benefit, or whether they could define after a patient starts taking a drug whether he's benefiting or not. In either case, that would be extremely valuable from a payer's point of view. When you think about those kinds of tests, you also have to think about the cost of those tests. If it's an imaging test, it's a lot less valuable because that's a big, expensive thing. If it's a biomarker, that would be more likely. What kind of biomarker is another issue. A genetic test or a genetic panel, an array would also be challenging because there are costs involved there. But nonetheless, the point is that if you could have sets of diagnostics that could either predict or define success, that would be cool, and it would be a real help in this industry.
Yeah, and I asked the question. I appreciate, Harry, that it's not in the 5-year horizon, but I think there probably are some younger companies out there, or some companies taking on innovation. And one way I think to think about that might be, getting a little bit less empirical and more prescriptive in terms of patient selection. We did have one question from the audience I wanted to just put to you, Harry, which is it possible, do you think, to compare the magnitude of benefit that we're seeing potentially from therapeutic classes today relative to the entrenched standard of care, and how that compares to innovation of the past? So, for example, comparing SSRIs to the tricyclic era.
Well, tricyclics weren't replaced because they were ineffective or less effective. They were replaced because they had side effect and toxicity issues. SSRIs, if you think back to the STAR-D study, really aren't, there are advantages in terms of tolerability and safety. Let's see how phase 2 translates to phase 3 results. I think that in phase 2, there are a couple of programs that obviously look much faster and look like they have dramatic impact right away. That is something that is not true of current antidepressants. Does that get sustained over time? And will larger scale studies show the same separation? We'll know a lot more early next year from Pastanel and eventually from 217.
Okay. And we have one more question since we're not completely out of time and we still have people hanging on. So vis-a-vis the comments made earlier about payers not necessarily caring or regarding productivity as a consideration, what about demonstrated reduction in costs of diseases comorbid with major depression? What impact does that have?
Significant. Could be very significant. The challenge is what the evidence is for that. So if you're going to use that argument, the way to use it is to say, okay, we've got this really good evidence for this, and we are going to, as part of our contract, warrant in some way that the plan will see that savings in that other category or area. That would be an extremely powerful argument to make with a payer. And in fact, we're actually working on several contracts right now in which sort of parallel arguments, we're making sort of parallel arguments that payers and that the payers are indeed accepting. So I think that's a cool idea, managed well.
Great. All right, and we do have some last minute questions coming in, but we will have to answer those individually by email. So thank you everyone for tuning in today's webinar. Thank you to my panelists, Harry Tracy and Roger Longman, and from Joel Sandler and Defined Health. Hopefully this was informative for everyone. Certainly learned a lot on our end, and found it to be a very productive discussion. So stay tuned for further Insight Series content coming your way. But in the meantime, thanks so much and take care.